Oh, hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. So we have reached installment number 2 of my Project Poirot series, which, like I said last time, I think really is going to take me smooth into next August. So I hope you guys are ready for a year of Agatha Christie. So last week we talked about The Mysterious Affair at Styles, and I kind of did an overview introduction to Agatha Christie, which I think I'm going to continue doing throughout this year. I have a number of books that I think would be relevant to this project that I've always meant to get to, that are either her autobiography, some books about just her life and just the time period in general. So I think I'll be kind of weaving that into this project as well. But anyway, for now, I think we've done a thorough introduction based on, I'm sure, how long the last video was. And yeah, today we're going to jump into the second one. And the second one is The Murder on the Links, which again features Hercule Poirot. Duh, we are in Project Poirot. And this one still does feature his trusty sidekick, Captain Hastings. Now, if you'll remember from last time, Captain Hastings is sort of an everyman in this universe. He's very good-hearted. He's a little bit slow sometimes, but actually he's not a total idiot. He's just very kind of confined by his own ideas about who is good, who is bad, what's right, what's wrong. And I think sometimes that basically gets in the way of him being able to see things very clearly. And this is certainly another book where we see this happening. So the overall premise of this particular book is that Captain Hastings has come home from the war. So the war is over, I think, from what I surmised. And he's working as a private secretary, kind of boringly, he's not that into his life, but the most exciting part of his life is that he is rooming with Hercule Poirot, so he gets into some of the detective action sometimes. And as the story starts, he meets this beautiful woman on a train, and he's instantly smitten with her. They really hit it off. They talk for hours and hours, and right before she's about to leave, he asks for her name, and she just tells him that it's Cinderella because she doesn't anticipate that they're ever going to see each other again. Meanwhile, soon after, he finds out that Poirot has gotten this urgent telegram from a mysterious man in France asking for Poirot to come help him because he knows some sort of secret and he's afraid he's going to be murdered, and he wants Poirot on the scene. So Hastings and Poirot scurry off to France, and they go to Monsieur Renault's house, and that is the person who sent for them, only to discover that he has been murdered. And the story really just progresses from there. It's a very solid whodunit, so if you're reading along, I hope you enjoyed the mystery components of this one. I think it's Agatha Christie. The mystery parts, I think, are always really solid. This particular one, though, I think really trades in a lot of sort of half-truths and misinformation about relationship dynamics, which I found to be very interesting because, as you know, I'm sort of reading this series through the lens of how is this reflecting sort of the mores and moral development of the time period. And really, two main things stood out to me in this particular book. So the first one is, again, some gender stuff, and I'm sorry, this is the part of history that I'm very interested in, is sort of the development of gender roles and the development of gender identity, all that stuff. So that is always going to be kind of a part of how I read this. But I did think it was fascinating how many strong women there are in this book, and how they really this is a book about various women trying to mislead Hastings and or Poirot. And that leads pretty naturally into sort of the second thing that really stood out to me, which is the fact that this book is set in France. So in sort of the tradition of English society or whatever, the French have a very interesting place, right? So I'm sure somebody who is French or British could speak much more articulately about this, but there's just sort of a natural enmity that has always existed between the two. I mean, considering that England as we know it was formed in 1066 when Guillaume le Conquérant came across the canal and, sort of subjugated the Anglo-Saxon people to French foreign rule. I mean, it's just like a history of a little bit of animosity. And in addition, by the time the 19th century rolls around, there's a lot of sort of licentious associations with the French, which I think have been around for a very long time, but particularly in English society, after the French Revolution, there's a perception that the French aristocracy sort of failed to keep their heads because they became so over the top, so indulgent, so overt in their excess and in their moral licentiousness, that it blinded them to the realities of what the peasantry were going through, and it sort of led to their downfall. Now, after the French Revolution, there was after the American Revolution as well, there was a lot of anxiety in England about, okay, well, shit, how do we make sure that all of our poor, underclass doesn't rise up and overthrow, the proper good aristocracy and wealthy people. And that is actually, when we talk about sort of Victorian morality, that is one of the major influencers of kind of how that came to be, because there was this idea that, okay, well, if we the rich people become much more modest and much more sort of low-key about how much more privilege and wealth we have, maybe we can sort of diffuse the class tensions and not have another revolution. So this is, nearly a century more than a century later, really, after all of this sort of starts. But that kind of association of Frenchness with moral questionableness, I think, is something that certainly is very baked into British culture from the 1800s onwards, if not before, of course. So the fact that we are having this book set in France and have so many French characters, I think just it raises some interesting questions and sort of associations for any British reader, I would think, at the time. And I think in particular, so there's sort of that bigger idea about Victorian morality and how we need to sort of like not go the route of the French rich people. And particularly a lot of that fell on women, right? So the French woman became sort of the embodiment of like a femme fatale, or, I don't mean this literally, but sort of like a whore of Babylon type thing. Like the French women represented like temptation and sensuality, and this really, like in the book of Proverbs, how there's the virtuous woman and then there's like the whore, basically the woman who's like leading the good righteous man into the pit. That is really what a lot of the associations with French women were for the British at that time period. And I think it's interesting that this book is essentially filled with French women, some of whom are more virtuous than others, all of whom I think can be characterized as manipulative, at least to some degree. So in some ways, this is almost, the morality stereotype about French women almost becomes a clue, a cultural clue in itself in the text, because there are a couple of male suspects in this book, but really I think the subtext should be to a reader aware of the context that, okay, there's a lot of shady French bitches around here, so like one of them has got to be involved in some capacity. And I do think that Agatha Christie is sort of playing on a lot of those tropes, and there certainly is a major plot line. And I never want to get too spoilery in this, but I do think it's fair to say that there's sort of a plot line that I think is playing on this notion of men, even French men, but men being lured and tempted by these sort of morally questionable and very like brassy French broads. Another interesting little side note about tracing sort of the relationship between the French and the English is you can really see it in the birth records, how people in England were feeling about the French, because during periods where there's, like, for instance, during sort of the Romantic Age, there's a real rise in the number of French names given to daughters in particular. So, you have a lot of more like Claudettes and things like that who are given these names as a reflection of the parents' admiration for some of the Romantic philosophy coming out of France, right? But once they're sort of feeling more patriotic and like more threatened by the French, either culturally or politically, you'll notice that there's a real quick switch back to like the traditional like Anne's, Margarets of the world. So that's kind of fun to look if you're looking in sort of the records. You can see a real pattern there. We also see the theme reemerging of things not being as they appear, which I think is a pretty common sort of tale or lesson from any murder mystery, right? There's a lot of, what you see isn't always the truth. Little Tati shout out for any of you Drag Race fans out there. But anyway, I think there's a lot of themes that have to do with things not being as they appear or things being different than they look. And again, we have Hastings, who's just sort of the embodiment of never really reading the subtext and always making assessments based on surface level dynamics or the way people look. He's very reticent to look deeper into people's characters. And I think the embodiment of this is at the beginning, Poirot and Hastings encounter a young woman, and their takeaway when they're discussing her, Hastings says, oh, this beautiful goddess who, is embodying all this, beauty and romanticism. And Poirot just sort of rolls his eyes and says, you see that? I see a girl with anxious eyes. So I think that kind of embodies a lot of what the perception difference between Hastings and Poirot is. And again, it's a recurring theme in Christie's work that beauty, surface beauty, does not mean inner beauty, and surface goodness does not mean that you are not a murderer, that you don't have that capacity within you. And as a side note, this book also just includes a lot of fantastic shading from Hercule Poirot to Hastings. Like, every time he just sort of like subtly shades the shit out of him, it really makes me laugh, because most of the time Hastings doesn't realize it, and when he does, he can't do much more than just sort of like get a little blustery. And like I said, I think that xenophobia is always sort of a theme in Christie's work. A little less so in this one, because there's not as many kind of like good English people around to be a contrast to the suspicious foreigners or whatever. But we get a rival detective. I believe his name is Giraud. So Poirot, Giraud. And he's also sort of a legendary detective, but he's not as competent, let's say, as Hercule Poirot. Though it's not like he's a blustering idiot, and Lord knows there's plenty of those cops in Christie. He's competent. He just is. I think essentially the contrast that Christie's trying to make is that Poirot's arrogance stems from true, like, almost preternatural gifting, but Giraud's arrogance comes much more from his position, right? So I think that she's sort of making a comment on arrogance or pride as being earned through one's skills versus through one's position in life. And I say preternatural, but actually I don't know that that's totally fair, because the recurring thing that Poirot always says about his ability to detect is that you just need to use your little gray cells. So there's a real focus on sort of natural, like very Enlightenment kind of attitude from Poirot about logic and reason and empirical evidence and science. I think he's very much a materialist in a lot of ways, but then he also always will talk about how he has a very bourgeois sense of morality. So I think it's interesting, because Hastings is sort of meant to be the everyman, but I do think that Poirot reflects a certain type of Enlightenment figure, which is a very strong commitment to more natural explanations of things, but still drawing on a morality that is based on essentially supernaturally based philosophy. And I think that there's meant to be a little bit of tension in that, or maybe not even meant to be. I just think that if you read the text and read this character, I think there is a little tension in terms of philosophical consistency and how Poirot thinks of his own abilities versus what he uses those abilities in service of. So anyway, I think that The Murder on the Links is a really solid mystery. I'm going to say that probably about most Agatha Christie's. We won't get to one that I know that I'm not crazy about for a while. So most of these early ones I think are really just like solid, good books. I had forgotten how this one worked out, and because I've read so much of her work and know a lot of her tropes, plus some of that historical context in terms of how we're supposed to think about certain different types of French people, I was able to sort of guess who was who pretty quickly, but it didn't dampen my enjoyment of the book. So I would definitely recommend this one. I'd call this like a solid 3 or 4 stars on Goodreads, which is like 4 or 5 unicorns in my system. It's not one I would recommend someone starting with necessarily, though I actually did give this to my mother as her first Agatha Christie, because she's a big golfer, and Murder on the Links, I thought that might be a fun little tie-in for her. So it's not, I think, like a standout Poirot, but it's like certainly a very solid one and a perfectly enjoyable read. So that is another installment in Project Poirot. I'm really enjoying this so far. I was, to be honest, a little trepidatious, because I was afraid that when I started rereading these books that they wouldn't quite hold up the way that I hoped that they would. But so far, so good. And next week, I believe, is Poirot Investigates, which I think is a collection of short stories. And I just love Agatha Christie short stories. So it'll be interesting to see how I'm able to talk about those cohesively, but I'm looking forward to it as a reread. So I think that does it for me. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined, and let me know in the comments below if you've read this book and what you thought of it. And I think that that does it. So I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I will talk to you guys next time. Bye!